I'm afraid this seems to be one of those things where everything's going wrong constantly. So if something goes wrong in this PowerPoint presentation on a Tedtholomew talk, blame the PowerPoint, because for some reason it's not doing what it's supposed to do. Sometimes it will, and sometimes it won't. And the times it will, I'll be the one that causes a problem. Anyway, on that note, this is the F-14 Tomcat, a masterclass in aerospace ingenuity and a jet with an all but legendary status as one of the most iconic and versatile jets of the Cold War era. The star of Top Gun, renowned for its variable geometry wings and one of the longest range missile systems in the world in the form of the AIM-54 Phoenix missile system, complemented by one of the industry's most powerful aircraft radars for its time in the form of the AWG-9, a symbol of American air superiority and certified badass of the skies. And so, it should come as absolutely no surprise it's hard to argue against the prowess of such a magnificent aircraft program. But I'm going to anyway, and on that note, welcome to my Tedtholomew talk on how you fell for the US Navy's propaganda. I'd first like to start off with an apology for my absolutely abysmal upload schedule. This year's been a bit of a wild one. Lots of bad things have happened, to be honest. Some good things in there, but a lot of bad things as well. But I think, fingers crossed, touch wood. Does bamboo count as wood? Don't fucking know, don't care at this point. But hopefully things are uphill from here onwards. And on that note, let us begin this PowerPoint presentation, and thus the beginning of your suffering on how I'm going to dismantle the F-14A and bring it to its knees so you no longer like it as much as you thought you did. But before we do that, we first have to go back in time. You see, in order to understand the F-14A Tomcat, we have to travel back to its origins in the Tactical Fighter Experimental Program, or the TFX for short. This was allegedly a failed joint project between the US Air Force and the US Navy. The program demanded a twin-engine, twin-seat supersonic aircraft that could carry both a high fuel and weapon loads, with the US Air Force wanting a low-altitude, deep-strike strategic bomber and the US Navy wanting a high-altitude fleet defense interceptor aircraft. Seems pretty straightforward, right? Introducing the F-111B, the Navy's unwanted baby birthed from the irritated bowels of the TFX program. The US Air Force requirements took priority over the Navy, and so the US Navy ended up with an aircraft with engines that could barely power a 5-watt light bulb, while simultaneously being prone to compressor stalls, with Vice Admiral Thomas Conley famously stating during a Senate hearing, "Mr. Chairman, there isn't enough thrust in all of Christing dum-dum-dum-dum-dum to make a Navy fighter out of that airplane." I appreciate I absolutely butchered the name of that place completely, but this is what gin does to people. Makes them illiterate. On top of that, the aircraft was far too large. It was also overweight and fared poorly in dogfighting. Moreover, the F-111B's side-by-side cockpit seating arrangement was a great asset for a mid-air drinking session with the lads, but a detriment to the US Navy's requirement for a capable dogfighting machine. So for all intents and purposes, the F-111B was basically the naval aircraft equivalent of a severely intoxicated elephant on shrooms. And so, in swooped Grumman with their far superior F-14A Tomcat, with its radically reduced weight, more powerful engines, astounding dogfighting capability, smaller size, and of course, it got rid of that pesky side-by-side cockpit arrangement in favour of a more streamlined tandem seating arrangement. At least that's what self-proclaimed journalists think and what the Navy wanted you to think, but let us dive deeper into this swimming pool of shit head first and take a closer look at those succulent undigested sweet corn kernels under a microscope. So for this particular recap, I'm going to hand this over to my past self. Thanks, future self. So, to recap, the F-111B was underpowered. It suffered compressor stalls. It was too large and overweight. It also had a side-by-side cockpit seating arrangement. And it had absolutely no dogfighting ability. Thanks, past self. The F-111B used Pratt & Whitney TF30 P3 engines. To understand why these engines were chosen, we have to go back to the roots of the TFX program, which, now that I say that, it feels like we've taken 2 steps back in order to try and move forwards, but such is life. But wait, what's that? Is that the F6D1 Missileer concept, the Navy's precursor to the TFX program? Oh boy, what engines did you use? I should have pressed enter at a completely different time there, but yeah, what engines did you use, Mr. Missileer man? What's that? You used TF30 P2s? Well, isn't that an interesting snippet of information? Don't know why that's there, but I suspect we're going to find out. And this is where the cracks in the US Navy's facade first start to appear. Well, that's why it was there. Part of the reason the F-111B ended up with the engines it did was because they were derived from the US Navy's very own Missileer project, but it somehow gets worse, because while the F-111B was indeed underpowered and did indeed suffer compressor stall issues, there's a caveat that the US Navy likes to try and avoid.
Altitude 8,000, 7,000, 6, we're at 6, man.
The F-14A used the exact same fucking core engine design as the F-111B in the form of the TF30 P412A. And the F-14A also mysteriously suffered the exact same issues, with being underpowered and also suffered compressor stalls. Oh boy, who could have predicted that one? Certainly not the folks who did the F-111B. But it gets worse again because the F-14's engines were spaced further apart than the F-111B's. As you can see there, the F-111B engines are pretty close together, F-14A at the bottom there, engine spaced pretty far apart. Meaning if one of the engines was to stall, and thus causing asymmetric thrust, there was a very real and deadly risk of the F-14A simply flat spinning out of control and dropping out the sky faster than the vegan teacher resorts to comparing spare ribs to a penis. Which, when you realise the context of the vegan teacher's whole argument was this video, probably goes without saying that's pretty fucked up. Anyway, the engine issues were so bad they accounted for over 28% of F-14 crashes. Engines were arguably derived through one of the Navy's very own programs. Worse still, these issues primarily occurred during air combat maneuvering, maneuvers that you typically do while in a dogfight, and also typically something you would do while in Zone 5 Afterburner, meaning while the F-14A was better than the F-111B at dogfighting, there was a very real chance you would just straight up die in the dogfight because one of the F-14A's engines would just simply stall due to reduced airflow, while the other one was, you guessed it, in full afterburner. Pilots died because the Navy thought it was a brilliant idea to keep aircraft with these terrible engines running as late as into the early 2000s. Meanwhile, when people talk about the F-111B's problems, they'll always blame the airframe for the compressor stalls. The engines weren't getting enough air because of critical design flaws in the F-111B's air intakes. And yet, when talking about the F-14A, they'll blame the engine and not the airframe, citing it was a primitive engine, inefficient and underpowered. In the end, it was probably a mixture of all of these things, but there's a caveat we'll get to towards the end of the video. The reality is, though, that this was an issue arguably born from the Navy's very own fucking decisions. In conclusion, if there wasn't enough thrust in all of Christendom to make a naval fighter out of the F-111B, then there sure as hell wasn't enough thrust to make one out of the F-14A either, unless somehow 2,400 pounds of weight on a 40,000 plus pound jet somehow makes all the difference between someone throwing a fucking brick and the F-22 Raptor. It's no secret that the F-111B was one long boy, stretching just under 21 metres in length, and with a swept wingspan of over 10 metres, this beast had a footprint that was big enough to give an aircraft carrier a nervous breakdown. Storing and handling this big bird above and below deck was like probably trying to park an M1 Abrams in a bike rack, to be honest. And given the negativity surrounding this, you'd be forgiven for thinking the F-14A was much smaller. But here's the kicker. It very much wasn't. You see, the F-14A clocked in at just over 19 metres in length and flaunted a swept wingspan of nearly 12 metres. So despite the myths, the F-111B and the F-14A were pretty much in the same league when it came to hogging deck space. I mean, sure, the F-111B was about 2 metres longer, but the F-14A was about 1.5 metres wider. That said though, some sources say when the when the F-14A's wings were in the stowed position, it made it about a foot narrower than the F-111B. And then there's the fact the F-111B could fold its radome, so it was only really about 19.5 metres in length. It's honestly all a bit convoluted and very much feels like arguing over whether Boogie 2988 is more retarded than Natalie Reynolds. It's just pointless, and they're both degenerates, and trying to argue in detail about it just feels like self-inflicted brain rot, to be completely honest with you. Apparently the Navy wanted an aircraft that was around £60,000. Now I assume this is an aircraft's gross weight, which is a bit of a wonky thing to work around because it's like asking what your car's loadout is for a given mission. It's determined by mission requirements like: how long are we travelling? Is Dave passed out in the back seat? Is there a dead body in the boot? In the context of aircraft, does the aircraft need equipment like targeting pongs, external fuel tanks? What weapons does aircraft need? And you get the idea. So let's break it down. The F-111B had an empty weight of around 46,100 pounds and carried 23,000 pounds of fuel. The F-14A, on the other hand, strutted round with an empty weight of about 43,700 pounds of fuel, of airframe weight, and packed only 16,000 pounds of fuel. It's a good job I have these written on the screen here, otherwise I'd be fucked. Anyway, it's pretty clear that the F-14A skipped leg day when it comes to fuel capacity. Both aircraft seem to have a similar drag coefficient and likely have a similar drag coefficient area as well, meaning the F-111B could probably fly a similar distance to the F-14A under the same amount of fuel, and because both aircraft were designed to carry essentially the exact same weapons, the F-111B realistically would only ever be around 2,400 pounds heavier than the F-14 under any given loadout. Consequently, the F-111B could only ever be around 5.3% heavier than the F-14A, and under the F-14A's typical gross weight conditions, according to Wikipedia, which, as we all know, is the be-all and end-all of factual information, the F-111B would only be about 3.8% heavier. But it gets worse, because the F-111B could not only carry more fuel and consequently fly further, but its max takeoff weight was around 88,000 pounds, about 17% more than that of the F-14A's 47,350 pounds. Now granted, my assumptions on the fuel and distance flying and shit like that are a little bit primitive, and some real aircraft nerds think the F-111B could have been anywhere up to 8% heavier under the same mission requirements, and to be honest I can understand that, because that's probably due to the slightly more advanced engine on the F-14A, meaning the F-111B needed slightly more fuel for the same journey, and the fact the F-111B needed a little more fuel to move the additional 2,400 pounds of airframe, but let's not get bogged down by that for now. But hopefully you're starting to see the light here. The F-111B wasn't the fat kid everyone made it out to be. I mean, it was a bit of a chunky boy, probably goes without saying, but one with some serious potential. Some serious potential. You can tell the alcohol's hit. One of the Navy's main criticisms behind the F-111B's ability to dogfight was the side-by-side cockpit seating arrangement, which, to To be honest, that's a pretty fair assessment. Rear visibility in the F-14B probably wasn't great, and the inability of the pilot to accurately assess the environment around the aircraft would indeed be a critical issue in the event a dogfight was to occur. I imagine it would likely be trying to parallel park without a rear view or passenger windows, with the end result being potentially being blown up if you get it wrong. Some people argue that the side-by-side cockpit arrangement was actually a detriment to the aircraft's speed, but then the F-14B's top speed was pretty comparable to the F-14A's top speed. Granted, it is a bit slower, but then that's it using inferior engines that were anywhere between 3 and 10 kilonewtons worse off for thrust, depending on which engines were used to determine said aircraft's max speed, which is probably due to the fact that General Dynamics actually tried to adhere to the Sears Hack rule, otherwise known as the area rule, as much as possible during the design phase. Long story short, Sears Hack rule is basically the best way of reducing drag on an aircraft as much as possible. That's a very oversimplified way of putting it, but you get the idea. But it gets better, because the side-by-side cockpit seating arrangement was derived from, you guessed it, the US Navy's very own misleading project. I swear you can't make this shit up. The US Air Force actually wanted a tandem seating aircraft, effectively meaning the US Navy forced a side-by-side cockpit seating configuration, only to then throw a tantrum in favour of the tandem seating configuration the second the first F-14B rolled off the production line, leaving the Air Force with the cockpit configuration they didn't even want, for essentially no fucking reason. Like I say, you can't make this shit up. Speaking of a side-by-side cockpit seating arrangement making dogfighting awkward, a lot of people criticised the F-14B because it was a terrible dogfighter, and they're absolutely right. But let's dive a little deeper into our swimming pool full of shit to find out why. To get to the bottom of this, we need to look at the original TFX requirements. From the Navy. The Navy didn't ask for an aircraft capable of dogfighting, which might come as a surprise to a lot of people, but no, their primary focus was on creating a long-range interceptor, like the Missilia project, for an aircraft that could haul a huge payload of missiles and take out enemy bombers before they even got close to the aircraft carrier fleet. It was about slinging missiles at long ranges, not getting up close and personal like in Vietnam. Speaking of which, then the Bushes started talking and Vietnam happened, and everything went tits up. The F-4 Phantom, which was also designed as a missile-heavy fighter, started getting a lot of flack for its dogfighting performance, but here's the real kicker. The F-4 Phantom's problems weren't really the plane's fault, they were thanks to the bureaucratic clusterfuck known as government red tape. Phantom pilots were essentially forced to use specific predictable flight corridors, and could only engage targets if they could visually identify them, and naturally, the enemy took advantage of this. And this completely nullified the F-4's biggest advantage, which was its long-range missiles. Instead of blasting enemies out of the sky from miles away, the Phantom pilots had to get up close and personal, meaning the Phantom didn't suck because it didn't have a gun like some numpties out there seem to believe. It sucked because the suits in Washington were more worried about government what-ifs and essentially made pilots fight with one hand tied behind their backs. Which is exactly what you want to do for people that are supposed to be living in your country and you're supposed to be serving them as a civil servant, as part of the government or something. I don't fucking know at this point. This whole situation's just, it gets increasingly more and more fucked the more you look at it. But it gets worse though, because after this bureaucratic shit show, the fighter mafia stumbled through the door, can of wife beater in hand, spouting off some alcohol-induced bullshit, now biplanes with the height of dogfighting prowess, and proceeded to vomit up their thoughts on how dogfighting was the be-all and end-all of aerial combat. And then the Navy consequently panicked and suddenly decided they needed a new aircraft that could dogfight, and thus the F-14B was unfairly judged on a requirement that didn't even exist when it was being designed. It's like ordering a large pepperoni pizza and then complaining it's not a small meat feast because you decided to change your mind while it was being plated up. before leaving the Air Force to then foot the bill for something they didn't even fucking order. The F-111B was doing exactly what it was meant to do, carry a shit ton of missiles and intercept targets from a distance. It wasn't meant to be a nimble dogfighter, because that was never part of the Navy's original fucking plan. And this is the part where I find out whether the music's actually going to loop or not. Oh my god, it actually is. It didn't last time. It ruined the whole thing. One item of concern I've read about is the fact the F-111B's landing gear was moved aft by about 8 inches and thus made it difficult to take off because you needed greater lifting force to rotate the aircraft on takeoff. But what that argument fails to mention is the fact the landing gear was moved aft in the first place because the F-111B had a tendency to pop a wheelie when being manhandled on the ground. And because aircraft generally rotate about their centre of mass on takeoff, I actually find it pretty difficult to believe this plane had trouble rotating for takeoff solely because its landing gear placement was supposedly bad. Now granted, the wings were in the aft position when this issue was usually apparent, but I do think it seriously brings into question the credibility of those claims that somehow it had issues taking off from a carrier. And moreover, the Navy by this point had rejected the F-111B at the time the carrier trials were done in favour of the VFX program, which is probably why the issue had never been brought up prior to this, because in the hearing it was before the aircraft carrier trials. Anyway, it was essentially in their best interest to make sure the F-111B stayed rejected, because God forbid they put a competent aircraft actually into service. But if that wasn't bad enough, the Navy only allowed testing of the F-111B on USS Coral Sea, an aircraft carrier known for being too small to adequately operate the F-14 Tomcat. Which is further evidenced by the fact that videos depicting the F-14s on Coral Sea were not only there for training, but they were also not really kitted out with any heavy ordnances. So if the F-14A wasn't able to properly rotate off Coral Sea, how the fuck was the F-111B supposed to as well, when it sported pretty much the same weight and same size? Yeah, you can see this rabbit hole goes pretty deep. It's pretty fucked, to be honest. Another argument against the F-111B was it wasn't very versatile and was quite expensive, which is a fair argument. The aircraft obviously wasn't designed as a fighter because, you know, it wasn't part of the original fucking requirement, but this led to the US Navy leading the VFX program, which obviously later birthed the F-14A. And that would be a fair argument on its own. You can understand, you know, new requirements pop up and suddenly your needs change and all the rest of it. But then the VFX program gave way to the lightweight fighter, and then later the naval fighter attack experimental program, which ultimately ended up replacing the F-14A for arguably almost the exact same fucking reason. The final item that leads to this aircraft being unfairly judged was the fact they were basically prototypes. Prototypes are quite important, and particularly important in the era of the 1960s because, surprise surprise, things like digital twins and complex simulation software simply didn't exist. Engineers very much needed real-world data to build their designs around, and this shows with the F-111B. In reality, the F-111B was pretty much on the precipice of greatness. Improvements were already in the works or in the process of being implemented to the pre-production models for many of the complaints made by the Navy. Things like landing gear changes, cockpit visibility improvements. General Dynamics even teamed up with NASA to improve the engine intakes in order to prevent compressor stalls. Like I say, something that's later in the video. They teamed up with NASA to, you know, move the issues of compressor stalls, which is probably more than could be said for the F-14A, but I didn't actually go into that much detail, so who knows at this point. But even things down to the refueling probe and the tailhook were being actively redesigned with data collected from testing. Hell, even lift devices were being re-engineered to improve their performance to the extent that some people actually argue that the final aircraft will perform better than the F-14A in almost every aspect in carrier operation. And this is why I think it's difficult to argue a case for the program that led to the F-14A. Not only did it suffer many of the exact same problems, but it ended up costing the US taxpayer an additional $40 billion in today's money for what amounted to a US Navy vanity project for an aircraft that was only really better at dogfighting, only to then effectively start the process of it being replaced about 3 years later after it was introduced with its eventual successor in the form of the F-18 Super Hornet. By contrast, the F-111B was on the verge of spreading its wings to fly, only for the US Navy to shoot it dead with a 12-gauge shotgun and complain that it stopped breathing. In closing, the F-111B would have and was a fantastic aircraft. Most of its shortcomings were either fixed or in the process of being addressed, and with the existing, albeit then handicapped, commonality between it and the Air Force's F-111A, it's difficult to argue that it wouldn't have saved money in the long run by spreading costs between the two divisions. Furthermore, one can't help but wonder what future improvements would have been made to the aircraft had it been accepted. You know, things like new engines, like those found on the F-14B and D models. But also things like a glass cockpit, maybe a digital flight control system like that found on the F-14D. I believe that has a digital flight control system, could be wrong. It may have also been used as a long-range missile platform to supplement aircraft like the F-35 as a more budget-friendly and naval version of the B-1R, or the B-1 Regional, I think it was called. Otherwise known as the Boner, which I think is a great name. But like all good engineering projects, it was doomed by fickle minds, bureaucracy, and unjust biases. But there's a more important note to end on here. While I'd be lying if I said I don't have a disdain for the US Navy of the 1960s, and their ability to never ever seem to know what the fuck they wanted, I have something they don't, and that's the glorious benefit of hindsight. The US Navy didn't know the F-14 was going to suffer the exact same issues. They didn't know the F-14 was going to be replaced by the F-18, and they didn't know how modern aerial warfare would eventually pan out. All they knew was the F-111B didn't fit their immediate requirements, and they needed something that did. This video was never about bashing the F-14 aircraft. It's a truly fantastic aircraft, and I say that without a hint of irony. But this video was about bashing the program from the vantage point of someone looking back on the program to show you just how brilliant the F-111B actually was for its time. The F-111B wasn't a failure, it excelled in what it was built for, and it did the absolute best it could with the technology available, and consequently there are a multitude of people in the F-111 program as a whole that should be celebrated for such an incredible achievement of arguably doing the job of the modern day F-35 program, of spreading costs between different divisions of the military, except they did it without the technology of today. To the point that even when people try to criticize it, they just talk about how great the F-111 platform was and don't really say a whole lot on why it sucked, even though they put it in their thumbnail. Isn't that right, Mr. Simon Whistleface? And some will even argue that it sets the foundation for the new fighters of the future, with many of them being speculated to be long-range missile trucks. But why this video? Why spend over 20 minutes bashing the F-14 program when the end result was actually pretty good? I'll tell you why. After the cancellation of the F-111B, they relegated it to testing the Phoenix missile system before unceremoniously retiring it. Most airframes were either lost in crashes or simply scrapped. But one remains, serial number 152715. This was the closest aircraft to being a production model. And here is what it looks like now. Now don't get me wrong, Wikipedia seems to think it's due to be restored, but let's be real. It's been sat waiting for over 50 years. And who's going to be motivated to restore this magnificent aircraft when they see degrading articles like these? So, after everything I've showed you, I've just got one question to ask. Is this the sorry state a critical piece of aviation history should be left in? I don't want just justice for me boy. I want this video to outright inspire someone to save him, to honour the legacy of this magnificent machine. And if this video somehow manages to set the dominoes in motion, to ignite a small spark, to kick someone up the backside, to restore this aircraft back to its original glory, then this video has achieved everything I wanted it to. And I'd do it myself, but I'm not exactly loaded with money, and even if I was, I'd have to not only get my ass all the way over to America, but somehow get airside clearance for China Lake Military Air Base, which, let's be honest, will probably never happen. Anyway, this isn't about facts and figures and whether or not I'd be allowed to see the last surviving F-111B. It's about passion, legacy, and giving the F-111B the recognition it rightfully deserves. To show the world that against all the odds and negative press, the F-111 was in fact a successful program. But in a really weird way, it all feels a little bit bittersweet, because on the one hand we ended up with not just one badass fighter jet in the form of the F-14 Tomcat, but we ended up with two of some of the most magnificent engineering marvels the world has ever seen. And for many aerospace enthusiasts worth their salt, that's something to be happy about. But there's a part of me that thinks the F-111B will just fade into obscurity and be, as journalists report, an overweight, underpowered failure. I mean, sure, it had its problems. The program was way over budget for one, but does all this negative press warrant the last remaining F-111B to rot away on an airfield in the middle of nowhere? I don't think it does. And on that somber note, ladles and jelly spoons, goodbye, and thanks for watching.